Welcome to the Polypolitics Podcast. I'm your host, Christopher Turner, where opinions are challenged and facts matter. A place for honest conversations and unfiltered perspectives. My guest today is Amjad Tadros, coming to us all the way from Jordan, an award-winning investigative journalist who served as CBS's Middle East producer from 1990 to 2023. Over more than 3 decades, he helped cover the wars in Iraq, the aftermath of 9/11, the Arab Spring, the conflict in Syria. He is the author of the book, The Fixer, A Journalist's Accidental Journey Through the Middle East. Amjad, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So your memoir is called The Fixer. For all of us who don't speak that language, what is a fixer? What is that?
Well, back in 1990, I was just a student, just finished studies in the UK. I was meant to be a mechanical engineer, and I finished college, and I was looking for a job. And at that time, Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait, so I didn't have a job, and the only job available in town was a job at an American news organization called CBS News. So I showed up, and they asked me if I could speak English. That's the only thing they were looking for. And I said, yes, I speak English. I have a degree from a very good university in the UK. And they said, okay, we'll hire you for the day. And then I understood that my job description was called the fixer. I had no idea what the fixer means. It turns out that the fixer is somebody who makes coffee, tea, run with tape, book hotel rooms, book transportation, and find interview subjects, go out the street to film with the crew. So essentially, you do everything that is needed to get the story on television. So I had no idea what the fixer means. And after a while, my Arab colleagues, were saying that the word fixer is very demeaning to us. We should not be called fixers. So they were protesting the use of the word. So at that time, CBS News issued some sort of a memo telling that we should not be called fixers, we should be called field producers. So, and in fact, my last job title at CBS News was Senior Middle East Producer. So over the next 33 years, I have learned how to become a television producer, especially in war zones. But when I sat down to write the book, I thought that the best name for the book would be The Fixer. So at that time, my ex-boss calls me and says, like, Amjad, why did you put the name Fixer on the book? I thought it like the word. I said, no, I never minded being called the fixer, because I always tried to be the best fixer in the business, so it's fine. I never wanted to be a producer, actually. I was happy to being the fixer. So this is where the name came from.
It's funny because, like, as someone who was born and raised, I grew up with like mob shows and stuff like that. You hear fixer, you hear that guy who's like, hiding bodies or something like that. But it was literally like a producer. It was somebody that was making sure all the stuff in the area was actually happening, right? And so,
Yes.
and that's really, really awesome. That's awesome. So, and you did that in Jordan, correct?
No, I started working in Jordan. Then I started working in Iraq.
Okay.
And then
under
I
Saddam
started
Hussein's
doing
rule,
the whole
yeah.
Middle East, basically. I covered basically more or less everything you've seen on 60 Minutes or on CBS News during that time. I was being involved in one level or another. Either by helping or arranging, or sometimes doing the story myself or finding the interview subjects. And I was, I consider myself to be very lucky, because I had a very good chance to have like what I call a front row seat to events in the Middle East.
Yeah.
So I have been to many places, and I've seen a lot of interesting stuff. But also in 1993, I was in a hospital. I was in a hotel room in Baghdad, and our hotel was bombed by an American cruise missile, and I got injured. And before I knew it, I was sitting in a hospital bed wearing a t-shirt, my underpants, and a sock. And who comes in to visit me? It was Saddam Hussein himself. So I got a picture of me kissing Saddam Hussein in a hospital bed. And that photo allowed me to work in Iraq for a long time, because after that, I was considered to be a victim of the American aggression. And Saddam used to send me a gift every year. So every January 17th, I used to get a gift from Saddam. So many people in Iraq thought that I was a very important person, because they thought I was a friend of the president, though I only saw him for 2 minutes and just got the picture. And that allowed me to work in Iraq unimpeded. Iraq was was a police state. There was a lot of security, intelligence officers everywhere. But for me, they always tried to avoid me because they thought I had something important to, because I had a link to the president. In fact, I had
Yeah.
nothing except, this 2 minute interaction with him in the hospital bed. And they used to send me these gifts every now and again.
That's so funny because I was gonna ask you, like, I mean, how difficult was that working for an American news organization
It was
in the
terrible
Middle East?
because,
Yeah, during all those times, right?
I
Yeah,
mean, me being an Arab, working for American news organizations, always being tough because I wrote it in my book. Because my fellow Arab, my friends and so on, they always accuse of being spies and getting paid, with American dollars. We are CIA agents, whatever. And and the Americans, they never trusted us because they thought, we're local, we have double, loyalties and so on. And for me, that was very difficult. But I always tried to be sitting in the middle, and it was very, very hard for me because I know what the Arabs say when they say something and what they mean, and I know what the Americans say and what they mean, and I can see that both parties don't even understand each other because these messages get. Yeah, but to go back to that picture, I was because I had that picture that I had saved on my Palm Pilot at that time. There were no cell phones, and so the Iraqis, you know, in the ministry of in the government, they left me alone. They never wanted to bother me because they were afraid. I was like, they thought this guy, is related somehow to the president, and that allowed me over, from that time till 2003, till the regime fell, to do, the most groundbreaking stories in Iraq for 60 minutes that won us a lot of awards, and nobody was allowed to touch those stories because I had this some sort of a special access inside the regime.
that's crazy. So all of those crazy. So like I was been in high school about that time, and I remember watching 60 Minutes when I was growing
Yeah.
up. So all those stories were attributed to you. That's why nobody else could get those stories because you you
Anything
had
that
you
came
had your
out from
picture with the
Iraq, yes.
president.
Yeah, because I was basically in charge of the coverage of Iraq for all that time. So anything
Yeah.
that you saw out of Iraq, had to go through me one way or another.
I mean, that must have been like you so aptly described. That must have been just kind of wild, being kind of like in the middle there. You're in the middle of an American news organization, a very oppressive regime, especially when it comes to the media and stuff like that, and navigating through that. How outside of Iraq? I mean, you've covered Syria, you've covered multiple different countries. Now, how was it working in those areas?
I covered Saudi Arabia and all the changes that happened. I covered the Gulf countries, places like Qatar and United Arab Emirates. I covered Egypt for a while and the war in Syria. And I covered also one of the places I covered most interestingly was Yemen. And
Hmm.
Yemen is a very, very interesting country that nobody even knows anything about or no one cares about it. So I called the chapters about Yemen in my book, called it Yemen is Important. And in the second chapter, I called it Yemen is Ignored. And one day I was in a Sana'a, we were doing some story, and I bumped into a guy who turns out to be Osama bin Laden's bodyguard. So I was like, wow. And after some convincing, I used to take him to Kentucky Fried Chicken. He used to love to eat Kentucky Fried Chicken. So I used to take him to Kentucky Fried Chicken, and I convinced him to sit in front of a camera, and he gave us this most wonderful interview and a very unique insight to the inner workings of Al Qaeda and where those people came from. And at that time, many people criticized us because they thought we were giving a human face to terrorists, basically. And I don't think this guy was a terrorist. In fact, we became some sort of friends. But for me and for us, it was, I think, essential to show the root causes of those problems, where they came from. So this guy Nasser, the bodyguard, had he been born in another circumstances or in a different country, he would have been probably a taxi driver or a bank manager or doing something else instead of him, joining Al Qaeda. So there is a lot of incidents in my book that I try to show people in the West because the book was written to mostly American audience. We have to find the root causes of the problems and try to evade them before the problem happens. Because usually what you have, we wait till the problem fester and then explodes in some sort of a violent action, and people try to find solutions. So it's better for us to understand all these stories, all these characters, like who was Saddam Hussein, where he came from, why he ended up to be who he is. People like the president of Syria, Bashar Assad, where he came from, what did he do. So, and this guy Nasser. And so I try to explain these stories. not to justify them, but to explain to people and make them understand what's going on. This is my photo with Nasser. That's him.
Oh wow,
So
that's
I
cool.
mean, that's very cool. Actually, it's one of the most interesting photos in the book. And I'll show you another one. And this is me with Saddam Hussein in the hospital bed. That's the famous photo.
That's your picture that got you.
That got me. That was my carte
There you
blanche
go.
to journalism. Anyway, so yes, so this is what basically I did. So
Yeah,
after 33 years, CBS gave me early retirement, and I decided to sit down and write this book and tell all the stories that I have seen and witnessed. Because I always thought, all my friends were always telling me, because I used to go out and do all these assignments in all these interesting places and come back, and I used to like, I'm a storyteller by nature, so people was like, oh, tell us what's going on. So I always tell them those stories, and people would always tell me you should write them down before we forget them. And so at some point I thought it was I had to write them down. So it took me about a few years to do it. It's not easy to write a book, especially when you write a nonfiction book, it takes time,
yeah,
and because you have to be accurate. And so I sat down and I wrote it, and went through it many times. I got some people to edit it, and it's published eventually. And it has really very interesting stories. I love people to read them, to know what's going on, to understand who we are, where we come from. Because people in the West usually look as Arabs as like one square black box, the Arabs. And in fact, we are so different.
yeah,
There are 400 million people. We are about 22 different countries. We speak different dialects. We don't even understand each other,
yeah,
when we speak. And we are so diverse. And one of the chapters in my story is called "Same but Different," and it talks about the people in Saudi Arabia. Because on my first trip to Saudi Arabia, when you go to Saudi Arabia, you see everybody wearing the same clothes. I don't know if you have, because they all wear white thobes.
yeah.
You know,
I've seen the pictures. Yeah,
yeah, and you all, so you look at them and you think they're all the same, and in
yeah,
fact, they're not the same. They're so different, but they wear the same. And so I try to explain to people, who we are, where we come from. There are lots of stories about places like Qatar, for example. Qatar is the richest country in the world, by the way, but per capita. Every single Qatari is a millionaire. There's a country full of millionaires. Imagine everybody is a
hmm
millionaire. There are no poor people there, and they are only about 300,000 of them, and there are about like 2 million people serving them. And the country came from nowhere. It's a very teeny tiny country on the edge of the Gulf that sits on a massive gas field that makes it so much money. You have no idea how much money they have for the amount of people there. And it's so
right.
interesting, to see how this country emerged. And we were lucky, to cover it over the years. We did a lot of stories about Qatar, from the beginning to the end, and all the things they did. And eventually, they did the World Cup. I don't know if you remember, 4 years ago, the World Cup was
I
held
do.
in Qatar. And for a small country like Qatar, people thought this is impossible. They cannot do it. They don't have enough people. But they had a lot of money, and they did it. And also they had Al Jazeera television channel, which also many people, accused of all sorts of things. And again, for a small country, how could they do that? And we were very lucky to had this inside access. And we met, the Emir of Qatar, the previous Emir of Qatar, the late Sheikh Hamad, who just passed away, by the way, and the new Emir. And we were taken into like very private places, and we saw how those people came from and what they're doing. And it's very interesting. I mean, I don't agree with everything they do, but at the same time, it was a very interesting insight to see how these people do it. And also, there are a lot of stories in my book about very weird stuff that you have no idea about. One of them is also one of the reasons I also wanted to write the book, because before the war in 2003, before the Iraq War 2003, what people don't know or didn't know, it was Saddam and his children were trying very hard to avoid the war. They did not actually wanted to go to war, despite the fact that everything they said in the media. And at that time, they tried to use 60 Minutes to open the doors for us, to show us that those people, we had nothing to do with 9/11. We wanted to get out of the war. We'll do whatever the Americans will ask us to do. But it was too late at that time because I think the Americans had their mindset to go on the war at that time. It was a different environment. And so we did a lot of very interesting stories, weird stories about things that were happening in Iraq, including one guy called Abdurrahman Yassin, who was implicated in the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center. And somehow we end up in Iraq. And we go up, we go to Iraq, and the Iraqis bring this guy called Abdurrahman Yassin, who was wanted by the FBI for $10 million. Still, if you go on the FBI website, he's one of the top 10 wanted list.
Wow.
And they said, okay, you take him. It's like, what do we do with this guy? Like, no, we don't. We're journalists. We are not actually the FBI.
Yeah.
So, there's a very, very interesting story about Abdurrahman Yassin. And you can cut me off if I'm going for too long.
No, please go, please.
But
I'm listening.
Also, the most interesting story in the book, which at some point I would love to turn into a movie or a miniseries, it's about a guy called Curveball. And who Curveball was? Curveball was an Iraqi defector who showed up in Germany and told German intelligence that Saddam Hussein had a factory in south of Baghdad producing biological weapons. And it was on whose testimony at that time Colin Powell, the Secretary of State at that time, went to the UN and he showed these big photos and they said that Saddam had these weapons of mass destruction. And it was on that testimony that the US went to war. The irony is that there were a lot of people, a lot of spies. The chapter is actually called Spies, Lies, and Double Agents in my book. And the irony was that there were many people who told the Americans that there were no weapons in Iraq. And the only person that decided to believe was this guy called Curveball, that they never met. All the information they got were second-hand information provided by German intelligence. Can you believe this? And this is basically when they went to war. And after the war, I was called to New York, and my boss at 60 Minutes at that time told me to go out and find Curveball. And the only thing they gave me was a phone number and a fuzzy picture of him. And it took me 4 years traveling to 7 countries. I'm showing something. Okay, so this is Colin Powell.
Yep.
The UN, I don't remember that.
Yep.
These are the photos that Curveball gave. Actually, they gave him a drawing set and he drew these photos. And this is the photo I have of him. That's the only picture they gave me, a very fuzzy photo. Anyway, so it took me 4 years traveling to 7 countries till I found him at the end. And I found him in Germany. And I went to see him. And he used to love to eat tiramisu. So I spent 3 days with him, having tiramisu in a German coffee shop. And he told me his story. Of course, it was a lie. But when he saw me the first time, he looked at me and he said, do you think that I'm an important person? Obviously, the guy was mentally disturbed. And for me, it was so shocking. It took me 5 seconds to find out that this guy is full of shit, basically. And for him to be able to deceive German intelligence and the CIA at that time, and for the US to go to war, a very, very expensive war that costed a lot of money and a lot of lives. I mean, it was 3,500, I think, American soldiers were killed and hundreds of thousands of Iraqis. And till today, Iraq has never settled down. And to believe that's just one guy who told them a story that was kind of credible. The story he told them could have been believed. It's not except that there was one little thing that was wrong with it, that the factory he was talking about was not producing biological weapons. It was producing seeds. And that was the only small detail that they could have checked, but they didn't.
Yeah.
And they went to war based on this testimony, which is so sad.
So how do you deal with that? I mean, like as a fixer, producer, whichever way you want to call it, right? How do you decide the credibility of somebody? I mean, how many checks does this go through? I mean, were you doing that on the ground? Was that happening back in New York at CBS? Because I mean, like you said, you could tell in 5 seconds this guy wasn't credible, but it's still interesting, right? You still needed to talk to him. How do you differentiate that?
I mean, I don't want to give myself the whole credit. We work in teams,
Of course.
and usually, we double check. We always have to double check the information. We have fact checkers after we do the story. People we go and they read every single word in the piece, and they make sure. Okay, do we make mistakes? We probably did a few, but this wasn't intentional by any stretch. And in fact, one of the other reasons I wrote the book, because you hear what's happening at 60 Minutes now at CBS News and so on, and being and us the previous people we are being accused of being like fake news and whatever they're accusing us of, and that drove me to sit down and write the book as a testimony to all the hard work we did, me and my colleagues who were very very serious journalists, people like Dan Rather and Ed Bradley and Bob Simon and Leslie Stahl and Scott Pelley. I worked with all those people, and these people are very serious journalists, and they don't take bullshit. And we actually work very, very hard, and we went to very, very dangerous places, and we lost many of our colleagues. I lost at least five of my colleagues that were killed in one incident or another. So for somebody to come and accuse us of being fake news and so on, it's really heartbreaking, because we really worked hard and we tried always we had one mission, just to find the truth and tell it to the American people, and that mission never changed, no matter what.
Yeah, I mean, and Scott Pelley was just fired, correct,
Yeah.
by 60 Minutes just recently, and he had come out and said that that the principles like that you're speaking of, right, that define 60 Minutes of true journalism, of making sure you fact check everything and being as correct as you can possibly that they were starting to disappear from 60 Minutes. Did you start
Yes.
to see that as you were leaving, that it was just starting to kind of,
To-
that those principles, those morals were starting to fade?
Totally. Listen. I mean, I worked for in the news business for 33 years. At the beginning, it was a very difficult thing to do from a technical standpoint, because the cameras were huge, communications was not that available, there were no mobile phones. We had to travel to Iraq, you know, travel by land over like 15, 16 hours to get to Iraq. We had to have this heavy equipment. So it was very hard technically to produce news at that time. But that gave us time to sit and think about the story before we go on television. Later, CNN came up and they started this live TV thing. Okay, that came up, and at the end of the Gulf War, 1991, and it started to propagate after. So there was more emphasis in the television news business about live TV. Like this guy is reporting live from this place. In fact, what you end up doing, you end up seeing, journalists standing on rooftops talking to other journalists about things that that none of them have seen, because they're sitting on a rooftop, but they're live. So that was the first shift in the news coverage in terms of television. Then with time, mobile phones came in, social media came in, and so on, and so all these methods have changed. Okay, but us as journalists, I always tell people the mechanisms and the methods have changed, but the mission is that it should never change. It is about telling the truth and finding a good story to tell. It's about storytelling. But people don't know about 60 Minutes, or don't, probably they know, but they don't realize it. 60 Minutes is a very, very good storytelling program. And it is based on one guy or two guys telling a story. This is what it is. Okay, if you think about it. And the story has to be good and interesting and important. So with time, we could see that the business has been changed, and then money came in, and of course, CBS in general became very money aware, because making television is a very very expensive
Yeah.
venture. And I mean, every 6 minute story you're talking about $500,000 just thrown in, thrown out of the window. See, this is excluding the salaries of the staff and the correspondents. The production. Usually it's between 200 to 300,000 for a domestic story. It goes up to $500,000 for a foreign story, because of all the travel and so on.
Right.
So it is expensive. So they started to become very much aware of money, and they start to ask you, before you even go to do the story, when you're going to finish it. And sometimes you don't know. Like it took me 4 years to do one story. Okay, at that time, they told me just go and find them. Nobody asked me how much it's going to cost. You understand?
Yeah.
I just went and I just was going everywhere looking for this guy. And we did this amazing story, and we uncovered this really, really massive blunder because there was no pressure for us to do it as fast as we can. Okay.
Yeah.
With time, they started to do that, and unfortunately, CBS was sold to different people, and it ended up with Paramount. And Paramount came in with an agenda. Basically, they wanted to dismantle the whole organization, and we could see the writing on the wall. And they started to come after us, one one after. They fired my boss first, then me, and then somebody, and I was called Pelly. And then when they started interfering in the editorial, like, we're the people on the ground. We know what we saw. You don't come and tell me, to change my mind. And we were always told by everybody that we should be very transparent. We should convey the truth, no matter how hard. For me, I have always sometimes put people on television that I don't agree with. Okay, but it was my duty as a journalist to get them to speak. And that is very, very hard. We did a lot of things that sometimes we go back home and our conscience are not clear because we give those people, maybe terrorists or people we don't agree with, airtime. And that's, but it is our duty to let everybody speak. We had Saddam Hussein on television. We had Osama bin Laden's bodyguard on television. Okay, do I agree with them? No, I don't. But also the audience is also entitled to listen to those people and see and make up their mind. Our job was not never to make people make up their mind. Our job was just to tell them the truth and what we saw, and let the audience decide. And then when the people start to tell us we have to show one side of the story or not the other, the audience is not stupid. I mean, look at what's happening at CBS News and at 60 Minutes. The audience is going to vote with their remote controls because if they know what those people are going to say, they know what's the agenda. And people, even if you agree with the agenda, you just go and watch a different channel. You just go and watch a movie, because you know what they're going to say. And that basically what's happening, unfortunately, to some of the news media. And it is really sad. And honestly speaking, I was so happy that I retired at that time because I could not see myself working for those people anymore.
It seems like it's happened with most of them, right? Like, I mean, you have everything from, CBS, CNN, MSNBC. I mean, like Fox, especially. Right? Like, you know what they're going to say before they're going to say it. Like what kind of agenda, what kind of thing they're going to move. And I try, because of what I do, to try to watch all of it, right?
Yeah.
To try to see all of it, and it's crazy to see how differently stories are presented between one group or the other group, and one news agency or the other agency, and I think CBS is a really good example of what happens when you lose like really good journalism, because there are, you're right, Americans aren't stupid, people aren't stupid, whoever's watching
People are not stupid.
they're not stupid. You know what I'm saying? Like, they know what you're doing, they can see through your BS, and it's just sad to watch it just completely erode, because it almost feels like journalism is stopping to exist.
Even if you agree with the politics of the news channel, you are not going to watch
Absolutely.
it. I mean, basically, you're shooting yourself in the foot, and it's really, really sad. And look now what's happening with this war in Iran, and look how different it is in the coverage from other wars. There are no press conferences, there are no briefings. We don't know exactly what's going on. Okay, we don't know. We hear second-hand information about people getting killed and so on. And it's so sad and it's devastating. And at some point, the truth will come out, maybe in a few years, and people are going to know what really happened, and people are going to be very disappointed. And that also on one side, and on the other side, is going to create a lot of frustration and anger and violence. And then people are going to wonder where terrorists come from. In fact, when I sat down to write my book, the first line of my book, I borrowed a poem from the early Arabic literature that says, "War is only what you have known and tasted. No narrative can describe it as well." And, one time I have an 8-year-old niece who lives in New York, and she asked me, she said, "Uncle, what is your book about?" And I thought about it, and I said, "My book is about war." I try to describe people to what war is. Because war is horrible. You have I mean, it's really terrible. Even when the war finishes, like they stop bombing, the war doesn't end. It takes years and years and years to fix the problems. And now you see what's going on in Iran. It's just absolutely so sad. because this is exactly what happened in Iraq 23 years ago, and nobody learned. And they thought, it's basically the same scenario with different actors now. And so, I mean, I want to go back to my book. My book is really funny. It has very interesting and funny stories, and sometimes you make you laugh. But it tells a very sad story about, devastation and how people die and why all these problems happen. And it's so sad. And for me, somebody sitting here, I mean, now I'm retired, but just looking at what's going on, it is just heartbreaking.
Yeah, I mean, you say you're retired. I mean, I know you're retired, but you're still there. You're
Yeah.
in Jordan right now. You're there. You know what I'm saying? And you mentioned the similarities between Iraq and what's going on right now in Iran, right? And
Yes.
I'll be 40 this year. I have many friends that served, in the Iraq War, and are devastated still to this day because of the Iraq War. Can you explain to us, like, in summary, how these two things are similar?
The two wars.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, first they both started on false pretexts. For the Iraq war started on the pretext that Saddam has weapons of mass destruction, and he didn't. And then the Iran war started on the assumption that Iran was building a nuclear bomb, and I don't think they were. I mean, there was no evidence that they were doing it. Okay, and today, nobody has shown us any evidence. And then they came in with a massive army and tried to change the regime. You cannot change the regime with air bombing. It doesn't work. I mean, in Iraq, they brought 160,000 soldiers to occupy a country of 30 million. Didn't work. You can't subjugate people. Same thing with Iran now. Iran is a 92 million people country, 3 times the size of Iraq, and it's massive. And also, Iranian people are not they're not the same. They are different ethnicities. We were told in Iraq, when they come, the new people are going to be welcoming to the American army, and they're going to receive them with roses. And some did actually, because they wanted to get rid of Saddam. I was there.
Yeah.
But a few months later, they realized that all the promises that they thought that the Americans are going to give them peace and prosperity never materialized. In fact, it became worse in their lives, and the whole country turned into a massive civil war. And the Iraqi people paid a heavy price. And now, when they're going to talk about Iran, we're going to change the regime. And what are you going to get after that? Do you think you're going to get a democratic regime? No. Do you think you cannot change the regime by force? It was the people who have to change. You cannot just come in with the airplanes and do it. And
Yeah.
Iraq was a very, very good example that didn't work. And are they going to repeat the same mistake in Iran? It's going to be more devastating because Iran is much bigger, and
Yeah.
more people, and has more oil, and it controls this Strait of Hormuz. That the Iranians themselves told the Americans, "We're going to close it if you attack us." That was not a surprise, but was
Yeah.
surprised that they didn't even believe it. So, okay, again, I'm not a defender of the Iranian regime, by the way. I don't
No.
agree with their politics at all. But it turns, but what they said was true. They said, if you come, we're going to close the Hormuz Strait, and we're going to attack our Gulf neighbors, which was a big mistake, by the way, but they still did it. And look where we are. The whole world is paying a very heavy price. American people are paying a heavy price at the gas stations now for this
And
fiasco.
everywhere else. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. At the grocery store, at the gas station.
And it's the same story that happened in Iraq. Same story. Yeah.
Yeah. Like I say, the only difference I see so far is that we haven't sent in ground troops yet.
Yet. Yeah.
Yet. You know what I'm saying? But I mean, this seems like like the beginning stages of that, and we're already at
We don't know. But again, but in terms of media coverage, there's a huge, discrepancy. That we don't know what's going on in Iran. We haven't seen anything, and the American government doesn't tell us anything. Even those soldiers that were killed in Jordan, we only heard about them 2 days later.
Yeah, and now numbers are being redacted on the people that were killed. Yeah, like the four that were killed in Jordan. Their names got just pulled off just recently, and Secretary Hegseth just had his meeting at the Senate and didn't answer anything. Right? Didn't answer.
Yeah.
Just asked for more money, even though it's like the highest budget ever.
$1.5 trillion.
Yeah, 1.5 trillion, as if it's not the largest defense budget on the planet or ever in America. Like,
can you imagine? The war so far, according to Hegseth, costed 37.5 billion. Can you imagine if this $37.5 billion were given to the Iranian government in cash, what they would do with it? The whole country would be turned upside down and the regime would fall. Why?
Yep.
Because those regimes, the Iranian regime and Hezbollah and all these people, they thrive on the misery of the people. The
Yeah.
poorer the people are, the stronger the regime is.
Yeah.
So when you come and bomb a country like Iran, and you bomb the bridges and the power stations and so on, you are not, the regime is not really affected. Who is affected mostly are the Iranian people. In fact, after the war, many of the Iranian opposition changed their mind because, when you start bombing a country and the people who die are mostly civilians, okay, you kill military and so on, but they're mostly civilians. And even the military, they have relatives and cousins and mothers and fathers. So people cannot sympathize with the people who are doing the bombing, no matter what the case is. Okay,
Yeah.
you are going, in fact, you're going to make the people close in together and, make the regime more powerful. The only way to undermine the regime is to bring peace and prosperity to the Iranian people, that they realize that this regime is useless,
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that's
I think that might be the biggest common thing between Iraq and Iran that I see is for some reason the American government thinks that if you bomb the regime or if you destroy the regime, that means it's all of a sudden they're gonna like Americans. Like that's not how that works, right? They just now hate them and hate you also. Like
Yes.
it doesn't
stuck
make
in the middle.
you like them, them like you and hate them. Like
Yes. And if you say that the Iranian people are anti-regime, and some of them are, and some of them are pro-regime, and the rest of them are just normal people like you and me, and come and bomb them. What do you expect them to do? They're going to sympathize. They are never going to sympathize with the people who are bombing them, no matter what.
Yep.
You're bombing their schools and their bridges and their roads and their power stations. They're not going
water
to sympathize
salination
with it.
plants and everything else. Yeah. Your desalination plants. Yeah. So you're in Jordan right now. I have to ask, you spent 30 years covering all this, another Middle Eastern war with the U.S. Do you miss it? Do you miss
Yes,
covering it?
yeah,
Not miss
yes,
the war,
I-
miss covering it, obviously.
Sometimes I miss the thrill because, being a journalist in the field is a very, very amazing experience.
Right.
I have been shot at 3 times. I have been, into war zones. I have been in palaces. I have been with very interesting people. And yes, it gives you some sort of, your adrenaline level goes up at that time. But also, I'm getting older, and I cannot see myself doing the crazy things I used to do. In fact, when I used to go back home, before, I never told my mother where I was because she would never let me out of the house after that. But right now, I feel like enough, خلاص, as we say in Arabic. Time to take a back seat and just let others do the story. Plus, I cannot see myself working for those people now, running the I always tell my friends who stayed behind that they are like the band on the Titanic. I was lucky to be on the first boats out.
Well, yeah, for y'all didn't hear about this. We had a great conversation about his amazing date farm that he has going on in Jordan right now, and he's really enjoying farming dates. So I don't know if he wants to jump back in the action that quick. But
Yes.
Amjad, I really appreciate you coming here and giving us your perspective on all of this stuff. It is absolutely amazing. You have literally had such a storied career and life and have brought information to Americans, including myself, that I don't think we ever would have known without your help and the things that you did there. So thank you so much, and thank you so much for being on the show.
Okay, that's my book. It's called The Fixer.
Oh yes, please tell everybody about your book, where they can find it and everything.
It is available on Amazon in 3 formats. There's an ebook, paperback, and hardcover. It's a little bit long, but it is basically written about very short stories that are stitched together that tells a bigger story. And people who read it loved it because it's kind of funny and interesting and important, but also it's sad.
Amjad's book is called The Fixer, a journalist's accidental journey through the Middle East. Check it out wherever, especially on Amazon, right? And everybody go read it. I'm going to go read it. That sounds super, super interesting and super, super fun. And thank you so much for being on the show. I hope you have a wonderful day, okay?
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Polypolitics Podcast on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts.